All right, welcome to No Way Out. Today you have Ponch, Moose, and G. We're going to talk about cognitive dominance, maybe some cognitive warfare, some information warfare, fifth gen warfare, liminal warfare, through the lens of neuroscience and technology. For those guests that are just tuning in for the first time, we do highly recommend you listen to some previous podcasts with James Giordano to understand the Sun Tzu a little bit better. We have some neuroscientists on the previous podcast, including Dr. McCabe. We have Enos Hippolito talking about active inference. From the physics side of the house, Adrian Bejan to really understand flow, the physics of flow. There's so many guests that have been on to talk about complex adaptive systems and so forth. But today we're going to dive into, I think, what many people are interested in, and that's neuroscience and technology. And more importantly, how do we hack our OODA loop and attack our opponent's OODA loop? And this may delve into warfare, sports, marketing, innovation. It's going to cover many aspects of John Boyd's OODA loop. So put your chin straps on and let's welcome our guest today, Dr. James Giordano.
Good enough.
It's awesome. Did I get it right?
Yeah, you got it right.
Thanks. Little bit of time in Italy there. Great to have you here today, Doc. And we'll put your biography in the show notes, but I do want to anchor on two aspects of your history. Number one, your time in the Navy. Number two, your time with the Marine Corps. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So after I did all my PhD work and during my postdoc time, I was a Navy Reserver, Medical Service Corps, went full active duty after that. Went through aerospace physiology training with particular emphasis on chem bio and biological engagement, both with regard to left of bang inferences for our own guys, as well as those ways that these types of things might be weaponized or used as disruptive or deterrents. At that time, we were still engaged in some interesting operations, not only in the desert, but certainly in Bosnia, Herzegovina. And we were concerned at that point that some of the older Soviet technology had filtered up and through, and that was obviously being used for a number of different disruptive sources. So I did all my operational time with the United States Marine Corps. I was at a Cherry Point, did some work back and forth to test pilot school, and also some stuff out on the West Coast with regard to ejection seat dynamics. So my particular area of expertise, obviously as a neuroscientist and neuropathologist, was the effects of high performance flight and stress environments, both those that we create and those that may be created not only for us by our competitors and opponents, but those that we can create that are disruptive, and how those then influence not only the flight environment, the aerospace environment, but any and all those who are involved with that environment, inclusive of special operations forces. So the idea of what is happening in the air and under the sea creates some special stressful environments physiologically and cognitively. And that was the kind of thing that I was involved with, did a lot of time, as I said, with Q2, mostly electronics and also some chem bio stuff. Was with Station Operation Engineering Squadron at a Cherry Point, and then did some work back and forth with the 26 Mu. So it was a good time in uniform. Very happy and proud to have served with some great people. As you know, all gave some gave all.
So two questions. You have a call sign.
I do.
Perhaps we want to hear how you got that. Maybe we'll decide that in a second. And number two, you work with Marines. So did you come across the OODA loop early in your career, or when was that? So you get your choice. Which question?
I was also a neurocognitive scientist. So the idea of the OODA loop in terms of how humans and other creatures create cognitive impressions build upon both non-Bayesian initially and then Bayesian type of processing was fundamental to a lot of my training. The OODA loop as a very simplified but important and valid heuristic brings all of those things under a common rubric. Each one of those aspects of the OODA loop, whether that's observation, orientation, decisions, and actions, as you know, are multifocal and multi-componential. And so the real challenge for us in the brain and cognitive sciences was to look into each one of those domains, each one of those operational dimensions, to be able to figure out the underlying physiology and how that physiology was important to the cognitions, emotions, and behaviors that ultimately drive those actions, and then to complete the loop, so to speak. So a lot of our work also engaged a broader construct of the OODA loop that was really axiomatic to John Boyd's initial thesis, which was that nothing happens in the loop without things happening on and out of the loop, inclusive of the consequences of your decisions and actions, and then how those consequences either affect positively or negatively valently in terms of cognitive consonance or dissonance, those Bayesian predispositions and biases that are so important to fundamental learning constructs. So our working construct of the OODA loop was the BUDAC loop or DUDAC loop, where the B or D stands for Bayesian biases and dispositions, and certainly the C reflects consequences. And those consequences are temporal. Those occur both in the short term in terms of immediate reinforcement consonances or dissonances, intermediate level, and longer term. And one of the problems is whether or not individuals are then responsive to those longer term consequences and being able to alter what may be their Bayesian predispositions to then change their observations and orientations. And that's where the idea of fixity of method in terms of cognitive success really requires flexibility of method in terms of the heuristic.
I say on that note, let's save your story behind the call sign to the end. Let's dig in. Let's go a little bit deeper
We'll
here.
do that at
My
the very
credibility
end.
goes right into the toilet as soon as
Yeah,
you
we don't
mention
want
the
that
call
to
sign.
happen this early.
Yeah,
in the
let's
show.
go. All right. So I want to summarize what I just heard. The OODA loop really describes the outer and inner workings of the action perception loop, the way we emit actions and perceive the external world. And you said it gives us a nice simplified view of that. We don't get into biology. We don't get into a lot of the genetics with the OODA loop, but we do know that orientation contains genetics, potentially some of our biology, our previous experience, our culture, and of course, what is known as new information or surprise that we get from active inference, from that surprise from the outside world. So that's a fantastic summarization of the view of the OODA loop, and I do like the idea of the Buddha.
May I add two things to what Ponch said?
Yeah.
So
Buddha.
Also too, to add to what Ponch was saying, the ability to analyze and synthesize and create novelty quickly. I guess what I'm gathering is that I think in line with what Ponch is saying, the OODA loop is not just some simple 4-step little tactical model that can be reduced. It's a lot bigger and has a lot more potential.
Yeah. That is, I mean, you have to think of the OODA loop as being strategically embedded within the lifespan of the organism, right? So the continuity of the OODA loop to contribute back to what then becomes those Bayesian dispositions and dynamics was initially a Bayesian predisposed, but not necessarily Bayesian system is important. The other important part to recognize, as you both mentioned, is that we're dealing with embrained organisms that are embodied, and that embodiment occurs in embeddedness within their environments and ecologies. So the internality and the externality of the OODA loop providing that level of flexibility and openness to a variety of different circumstances that base upon both prior expectation and realistic reinforcement is fundamental.
Wow, blown away. Let's dive deeper in a moment. Before we do that, I want to look at some common definitions, or look at some definitions of what many people are hearing on social media today, and that's fifth generation warfare, liminal warfare, gray area warfare. I just want to get your take on what is fifth generation warfare, and does it fit into the neuroscience and technology, neuroweaponization that we're talking about, and same thing with liminal warfare. What's your take on this?
Rather than sort of get down into the weeds with each one of those, I think it's probably fair to put them all under a common rubric, which is that there's some level of both symmetry and asymmetry in the current disruptive space, whether that's a competitive space or a conflictive space. So what you're seeing is essentially three things dynamically and interactive. Number one is some level of cooperation, characteristically with allies, but not just. In some cases, that cooperation does occur with potential competitors. And what that does is essentially probe those cooperators, collaborators, and ultimately competitors' weaknesses and strengths. And that's vital for the next stage, which is actually to develop those domains and dimensions of asymmetry that are going to produce leverageable capabilities that are then exercisable in hegemonic domains. So if you're looking at the idea of fifth gen warfare, or realistically fifth gen engagement, let's move back from warfare, because much of that fifth gen space is going to be non-kinetic. And that non-kinetic domain is going to be influential domains in terms of disruption and deterrence, rather than what may be purely defined as kinetic engagements. Kinetic engagements, I think, are militarily and politically relatively easy to deal with because we know the operational rules of engagement. Non-kinetic engagements in that sort of fifth generational space become far more difficult for four basic reasons. The first is they're non-kinetic. And mounting any kind of response to a non-kinetic threat or a non-kinetic harm is difficult unless there is direct attribution, which then brings us to the second point, which is many of those non-kinetic engagements occur within what is essentially a legal space. So attribution can occur within the legal domain, but very often there's been some preemptive exercise within that domain to create predispositions in the legal environment, which is now being referred to as lawfare. So in other words, a particular nation state or group, or perhaps even virtual nation, even using virtual currencies, can create particular dynamics and parameters within international law that is auto-favorable, favors their own interests, and therefore any transgression outside of those interests might be seen as problematic. Well, then that defaults back to international law, or at least national law, with regard to intellectual property and other particular legal parameters. And then that nation state or virtual nation can then exercise legal probity and say, look, we were coloring between the lines. Just because it's not your law, it's our law. And under international law needs to at least be respected with regard to acknowledgement for discourse and potential appeal. That just draws out the non-kinetic influential time space. The third is that very often non-kinetic engagements are specifically oriented towards the fog of engagement, the fog of war, the whodunit. Is it actually an engagement? Was this actually intentional? Or was this just artifactual as a consequence of many of the domains of the non-kinetic space, whether that's the bioeconomy, whether that's informational, whether that's psychological informational, and in some cases that may also be purely biophysical. But once again, the question then becomes, was there intentionality involved, or was this artifactuality? Intentionality then has to defer back to the idea of some level of attribution. Now that gets tricky. And then the fourth domain that I think is really important to the whole exercise is that very often these non-kinetic engagements can be done in ways that are clandestine, at least, and covert intentionally, which then fortifies the third domain, which is the relative fog and ambiguity that necessitates the dedication of resources on the part of the group that has been assaulted or engaged, and then only expands the time frame necessary to be able to maximize the opportunities for further use of either the science and technology itself in disruptive ways. In other words, version 2.0, 3.0, keep them on their toes and guessing. Just when they figured the first thing out, boom, you hit them with something new, or at least a novel development of version 1.0. But you just hightail it the hell out of there, which then leaves attribution very, very difficult, because there really does not appear to be any viable trace that's significant enough to be able to generate the necessary military intelligence and or even political economic force, capability, and leverageability to be able to then point a finger accusationally. So again, I think rather than talking about warfare, it becomes far more salient to talk about non-kinetic and certain types of kinetic engagements operable within this fifth gen space, which by nature of that is axiomatically asymmetrical. And by nature of the conversation we just had, there's a lot of fogginess there, ergo your gray zone.
So for those of us that have done a lot of professional reading, as we're required to do as military personnel, right? We have reading lists, and one of the reading list items on many of the lists is Unrestricted Warfare, which is written by two Chinese officers, talking about how they're not necessarily planning on something kinetic as a showdown in the South China Sea. And we had Boyd's friend and collaborator, G.I. Wilson, on our show to talk about this exact point, that they might be involved in lawfare. They might be involved in smuggling. They might be involved with media influence, TikTok, that kind of a thing. Yeah. That's going to disrupt us that way versus, we're all from the naval services, right? Head-to-head showdown might not be the best idea for them, right? It might be something else that maybe other people aren't considering, or maybe other people aren't thinking about. I mean, it sounds, as you describe those four things, that seems to me to resonate what we're being warned about from Unrestricted Warfare, and then the paper that they wrote years before that, 10 years, The Changing Face of War. Mm-hmm. And they wrote that.
There are a couple of things. I mean, you mentioned earlier some of the work of Sun Tzu. And axiomatic to that work as part of that doctrinal stance is know yourself very well, but know your opponent even better. And being able to engage in understanding of the biopsychosocial dynamics of whoever is going to be the competitor, and clearly in this case, the competitor is the longstanding, in quotes, West, I think speaks very, very strongly to three things once again. Number one is that China does have a strategic plan oriented towards at least 2049. And it's a consistent strategic plan across a variety of different domains, S&T, and that S&T obviously being duly usable, simply being one of them. The other is within that strategic plan is tactical maneuvering based upon whatever your competitors and opponents do. Far more like a game of Go rather than a game of chess or checkers. The idea here is to exercise some sustainable advantage rather than a clear win. There is no end to the game, so to speak. It's a long game, which is really more of a long engagement, which in some cases plays to both the weaknesses and the strengths of the West, particularly the United States, in that we change administrations every 4 to 8 years. And at least implicitly, when those administrations change, there's the king is dead, long live the new king. And as a consequence, those tractionable entities of the prior administration can get very easily shuffled under the desk into a drawer or literally thrown into the circular file. And as a consequence, it then creates exploitable opportunities for our competitors to be able to see where those strengths and weaknesses lie anew and hit them at the shift points. I mean, the more something is consistent but flexible in its consistency, the harder it is to topple. But if in that flexibility you're getting inconsistencies and literally changes of pace, direction, and tempo, well, then that becomes a little bit easier to manipulate in a longer game, and they certainly recognize that. The other issue is that part of that strategic plan, the idea of a longer range plan, is that it tends to work retrospectively. In other words, what you get is something prospective. Where do we want to be in 2049 in terms of the S&T and how that's leverageable on the global stage, bioeconomically, in terms of the actual capability for force influence across a range of domains, lifestyle, health, orientation for heroic rescue, etc. And of course, within the military as duly usable entities, both to buff up one's own people and to degrade or to disrupt others. But then the other issue really becomes, okay, if this is where we want to be at year X, well, let's just say that year is 2049 because it's historically and politically significant for our trans-Pacific competitor. Well, then what things do we need to do now to be able to realize or fertilize that geography and terrain, so to speak, whether that's spatio-temporal or both, and situationally, to allow those things to successfully bloom into the garden we want to be able to reap in 2049? It's a very different sight picture and it's a very different game plan. Along with that is, as you'd mentioned, the incorporation to multiple domains of what can be seen as the competitive space. Lawfare being one, psychological operations inclusive of being sensitive to the psychology of your competitor, not necessarily pure psyops in the sense that we define it in terms of those things that are influential, but those things that are sensitive to and responsive to what appears to be the zeitgeist or Weltanschauung, the worldview of whoever's going to be your competitor. And understanding that gives you insight to the nuances of the things that they desire. And everything neurocognitively is based upon a rather simple, fundamental, but I think heuristic equation, which is that individuals and groups, whether operating idiosyncratically or systemically, are orienting towards maximizing the expected value of gain over the expected value of loss. In almost every situation we make, our brain defaults to some level of utility, even within a variety of other constructs, whether it's duty-based, whether it's theologically based, etc. At the end of the day, we are egoistic, both idiosyncratically and systemically, and our peer competitors know this. And so appealing to those things that are going to have at least some level of apparent expected value gain versus loss is very important in then determining those aspects of psychological engagements by things like media, narratives, postures, semiotics, iconographies that are influential on both a subliminal and liminal level that then also in some cases feed back into lawfare because the nature and tenor of the law, that the narrative of that law has characteristics that are intrinsically appealing to parts of our psychology, or at very, very least, create an argument that is a logical and rational argument. In other words, the if and the then comport as a rational argument, and it feeds back onto Western philosophy much of its own tenets that sort of leaves us stepping and fetching and going, yeah, that's right. So sort of playing our game. And the last aspect that I've said elsewhere, and I'll reiterate here, is that our peer competitors, and this is both transatlantically as well as transpacifically, have a relatively seamless triple helix of government, the research enterprise, and the commercial enterprise that allows, again, a seamless, boundless, and very, very rapid transfer of resources, skills, services, deliverables, widgets in and out of these various domains as politically motivated by a variety of different dimensions, not least of which economic, obviously biopsychosocial in terms of things it can affect, but clearly political and military as well. So I think those factors are very important to understand with the entirety of the dimensionality and complex dynamics that we're seeing with regard to this new global shift.
Okay, so we're talking about the mind here, the battlefield, the brain as the battlefield of the 21st century that you write about quite often. In fact, in one of your papers, you bring up right away, the key to victory or defeat in war is people. The key to people lies in the brain. We also know that I believe China's doctrine right now is about mind superiority. Mm-hmm. And then Russia has something known as reflexive control doctrine. And of course, John Boyd famously said, machines don't fight wars, people do, and they use their mind, people, ideas, and things in that order. Some of the things you just talked about were really about how do we fold our adversaries back inside themselves, right? Morally, mentally, and physically, without suffering the same fate ourselves, right? That's something that we get from John Boyd. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day here, we're talking about maybe information warfare and cognitive warfare or overall cognitive dominance. How do we understand what's going on in the minds of others and so forth? Dr. G, can you help us understand the difference between information warfare and cognitive warfare, if there is a difference, and perhaps take a look at it through the lens of the OODA loop?
No, I think it's important to consider those as existing along a constellation or spectrum of capabilities and also context, right? So, I mean, if we're talking about information is important to cognition. I mean, what we do cognitively is we take in sense data. We then assimilate those sense data with regard to some prior disposition or orientation to what those things are based upon how we're sensing. That gives us a perception. That perception very often is linked to some cognitive domain that we like to call emotionality. And there's nothing that is neutral. Anything is either positively valent or negatively valent. It's just a question of where on that sliding scale we list them. I mean, if you really think about it, and if you ask the listeners to think about it, think about your idea of neutrality. You're not really neutral about anything. You know, you could say, well, I'm kind of neutral about Brussels sprouts. Yeah, but wait a minute. If it was a question of Brussels sprouts and ice cream, well, okay, somebody would go for the ice cream, somebody would go for the Brussels sprouts versus pizza. Somebody's going to go for the pizza. So what tends to happen is that neutrality is really a relative neutrality. And what we're really doing is we're hierarchizing things all the time based upon the way they relatively feel to us in terms of gain or loss, pain or pleasure. Okay. Understanding that, information plays into the cognitive domain because information, both in terms of current information, as it may have some speculative and predictive value, this will lead to X, Y, or Z. Or as it has referential value, this then reflects Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, is important because it's evocative for not only those cognitive domains, but those emotional domains that drive decision makings and actions. So the informational space and the cognitive space really represent an interdigitation, a true interdigitation of one hand sort of washing the other. The way we cognitively make sense of information is based not only on the information itself and the relative radicality of the information, what in the philosophical language is sometimes referred to as the Ding an sich, the thing unto itself, but realistically our perception based upon our sensation of that is then ground to some recollection of its relative meaning contextually for us. So understanding that informational dynamic as an important cog in the cognitive wheel can become exceedingly important in controlling and influencing narratives, symbols, expressions, dynamic interactions that are all operable within the human terrain.
Okay, so on information warfare, I understand it as controlling the flow of information. We can get that done through suppression, amplification, disinformation, misinformation, maybe even influencing the psychological safety of an environment. Does any of that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think we need to go one step further.
Okay.
It's also influencing and affecting the content of the information. And by the content, I think we're talking about two things, the actual content itself and its construct of presentation. In other words, how are we spinning that content? Are we spinning it in a way that then is evocative of a particular emotional valence that may be reflective of what we know who is ever going to be the recipient is resonant with or to? And I think that then becomes very important because that brings us then squarely into the psychological cognitive domain.
Right.
One of the things that I think speaks interestingly to Boyd is what I'd like to call Boyd 2.0 or 3.0. And Boyd's comment there is that Machines don't fight wars, humans fight wars. Yeah, humans do fight wars, and they fight wars in the domain of both the mind and, if you will, muscle, in other words, military might. But increasingly, there is a reliance upon technology and machination. I mean, this reflects some of the work of the cognitive scientist and philosopher Merlin Donald, who's looked at epochs of cognitive development across human anthropological history. And what we see now is we moved into the cognitive technological domain, where there's an increasing, at least symbiosis or cognosymbiosis, if not actual fusion. And in this case, it's not just a hybrid fusion, it's becoming ever more of a chimeric fusion, at least a functional chimeric fusion, of what humans are capable of doing and what adaptive assistive neuro and cognitive technologies are able to do in a way that is reciprocally beneficial, where the human essentially teaches dynamics to the machine or machine system, and the machine system does same to the human. But our group, specifically working with two colleagues of mine, Dr. Rachel Wertzman and Dr. Diane DeUlis, have also pointed very strongly to the development, the iterative development, viability and arguable value of what we have referred to as neurint, neurological intelligence and neurocognitive intelligence, where it's not only utilizing machine-based systems to assess what are the actual mechanics and processes and dynamics of human thought across its various ranges of expression and engagement, but also utilizing those techniques and technologies to actually interface with human thought, human cognition, and human behavior. So the idea here of increasingly complicated, sophisticated, and precise human-machine teaming, where you're now getting reciprocity, whereby the aspects that are beneficial and functional are over-functionalized or hyper-functionalized, and those areas of limitation and weakness are therefore gapped and bridged as a consequence of both. So pro Boyd, certainly there are humans in that loop and on that loop, but somewhat contra Boyd, the idea that the machines are going to play an increasingly dominant or at least expressive role in parts of that loop are becoming the reality today, not in the near future, today. I mean, we see that already. And part of the challenge and opportunity is to understand those processes, both on the human side and on the machine side, and to understand what's going to be necessary to both guide and govern them in those ways that are going to be commensurate with international law, laws of international and rules of engagement, or to what extent contemporary ethics laws, inclusive of military laws, may need to be revisited, if not revised, or not completely generated anew, to remain apace, if not slightly ahead of what the technology is capabilizing us to do.
Okay. So I do want to come back to cognitive warfare in a moment. Some of the comments you brought up here triggered some thoughts about the USS Vincennes years ago when we accidentally shot down an Airbus. And then, of course, the collisions 2017, where we had ships at sea that were just doing some basic, I hate to say basic navigation. It's not basic in the military, but we had some tech or human machine teaming challenges, you might say, potentially brought on by some acceleration of technology. As we get into this domain of the human machine interface, keeping humans in the loop, can we go back to that a little bit more? How important is that in your mind when it comes to decision making and sense making?
Debatable. I mean, I think in terms of a broad-based philosophical and sociological set of Western constructs, and again, Western in quotes, it's very important. I mean, clearly the idea of the individual and the primacy of the human person in any and all actions that deal with humans has been a long-standing tenet of so much of Western philosophy, and to some extent Eastern philosophy as well. However, one of the issues that I think becomes very important to understand about some of the Eastern philosophies is that they are by nature naturally ground. Let me explain. In other words, they embed the human in the human's natural environment with appreciation for that environment. I mean, even something as simple, and I'm being very, very tongue-in-cheek, as the symbology of yin and yang demonstrates the interaction and reciprocity of those particular forces in dynamic interaction, in complex dynamic interaction, right? Where one increases, the other may increase, but there's an essence of each in both. And as a consequence, what does that mean? So the extrication of humans from their environment is not something that has been axiomatic to much of Eastern philosophies, whereas in the West, There's more of a humans having dominion over those environments. Fair enough. However, this is where things get a little dicey. Your question as to what that might actually mean in terms of the way we approach some of these cognitive dynamics, I think changes as well. So if we look at what those issues are with regard to humans being in or on the loop, for us it may be important because of the primacy of human value. However, there is also the construct of whether or not humans are imposing a builder's bias over the AI, and in that way tying AI's hands to do what AI or machine learning can do best, which is to compensate for human foibles. So if what we're looking for is someone to correct us and keep us in line, well, obviously, if what we're doing is going back and saying, no, don't do that, do this, then what we're really doing is at least implicitly autocorrecting ourselves and simply using the machine as the tool. That may be okay, but is it sufficient? And here's where it gets arguable. There are schools of thought that would suggest that humans on the loop provide a fail-safe mechanism that allow whatever's going on in the loop to occur, and so that there is at least one step where things come out of the loop and is then disseminable, usable within human ecologies, where humans have to give the ultimate thumbs up or thumbs down. And as a consequence, they can then feed things back into the loop that can then modify what's going on in those machine learning and or AI loops so as to be more commensurate with what are the values and values desiderata of the human users that are then going to entail, obtain, and ultimately utilize whatever is coming out the other end, so to speak. But here too, what you're then getting is a post facto bias. There is a third school of thought that says, look, if we build the device in particular ways and construct not only heuristics for it, but also provide some mechanisms by which it can develop some type of quasi-hermeneutics. In other words, it can see into what the human users need and want, but do so on a more expansive level. Might it be then that the machine system is able to appreciate a construct such as global citizenry far more than if, in fact, a human user were to develop a system that may be at least implicitly, if not explicitly, oriented towards more proximate goals? So here you have to entertain the idea that the system itself, if given doctrine, parameters, could create systems that are far more expansive and potentially beneficial for humans on the whole to be able to be appreciative and engaged across dimensions of what might be cultural separation and non-consensus versus those systems that are necessarily fostered and engendered to have something of a narrower precept or a narrower facet on that lens. Of course, the backside of that, the potential dystopian aspect of that, what appears to be utopian view of machine learning and AI, is could the systems themselves then be able to demonstrate or construct what they view as common goods and begin to utilize those common goods as reparameterization for human culture, human conduct, human concepts, constructs, the human condition in those ways that are not necessarily fully transparent to the human user. And this is what is sometimes referred to as a reverse Jehovah phenomenon. In other words, now the creation becomes far more, quote, godlike than the creator, and then takes on creative capacities that are not necessarily, fully visual or fully visualizable to those who are then being subjected to them. So in other words, if I'm telling you, well, this is for your own good, because I'm able to see around the corner over the block and sort of over the edges, and you can't, are you going to trust me? So the question here is whether or not that type of a system becomes paternalistic, that tends to have a negativistic connotation, do what I say, not as I do, and therefore exercises some level of controllable dominion, not always positively, or parentalistic. In other words, being loco parentis, whereby the trust that we put into that would be the same as the child puts into the parent, which again gets back to the idea of sort of reverse creation or reverse construction. We'd like to think that, in fact, that we're the parent and the machine systems are our offspring. But at what point do we sort of surrender that, as we very often do as we age, and go, all right, son, daughter of mine, you take care of me because I'm becoming a little more enfeebled and you're far more technologically capable than I am. You seem to have known more. And as a consequence, you have a very, very different feel for the novelty and various aspects that are simply brand new of your environment as it affects me. So those three dynamics are entertainable for sure.
Would it be not, so it wouldn't be peer to peer? It sounds like when you say paternalistic, it sounds like it would be more of a subordination, like the human actors are subordinate to the machine. And as a dad of kids, I immediately think of the movie WALL-E, the Pixar movie, where the control, the artificial intelligence takes control of the human population over several years. That's what. Yeah,
it's a good point. I mean, I think it's what's sometimes referred to as the Latourian question from the work of the historian of science, Bruno Latour. Science doesn't necessarily give us answers. It just prompts ever more provocative and controversial questions that we're then tasked with answering somehow. I think the problem with paternalism is that it's taken on an ethical connotation that has been negativistic. Clearly, some of the bioethical work coming out of the 60s and 70s with regard to controllability, et cetera. And when you see that in any term that may have a security implication, it stinks, right? We don't like that idea. But the idea of protection, again, I think is multifocal, or at least is two-edged. Clearly, we're looking for something to protect us. I mean, think here of a blade, a knife. Yeah, so it can be very, very useful. It can protect you until it drops. A falling knife has no handle. So here too, the question is, where will the blade cut? And am I going to be on the right end of the blade? Or is it that there's something intrinsic about that knife that requires a new set of skills for me to use it in those ways that are going to be beneficial to me? Well, if in fact the knife itself comes with a set of not only instructions, but actually something that is proactive to guide the user in how to do this well and how to do this appropriately to use that tool, well, there's some benefit in that. That's the idea of parentalism. In other words, as a good parent, you can appreciate there are certain things that your kids can know because of their existing knowledge base, going back to that whole Bayesian thing. What can they relate to? And they're not yet ready to know for a variety of reasons. They don't understand the workings, the mechanics, or the implications of that. If in fact they know this, knowing leads to doing, and they're certainly not in a position to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. And or it's something that they simply cannot get their head around. In other words, there are aspects of that are not only unknown to them, but are too complicated for them to know right now, given the expansive knowledge it would require, right? So what you do as a good parent, at least ideally, is to take care of your kids, take care of your offspring. You protect them in those ways they need protecting. You give them information they need to grow and to progress. You let them grow and progress, and you do so in an iterative way that's ever more reciprocal, that allows you to take your hands more and more off of them as they grow and mature, but you're guiding the maturation process with regard to a common vision of what's going to be their desirable good or a valuable good. Well, I mean, there's something, at least axiomatically, not to belabor that term, benevolent to that, wanting to do good. The problem is whether benevolence translates into beneficence in practice, because what may be good for me may not necessarily be good for you, which then gets back to the point that if we're developing machine learning systems, cum AI systems, those AI systems, by their literally nature, should be oriented towards humanity as a whole, appreciative of both those things humanity has in common and those things that humanity has in distinction, to have a reconciliatory effect towards those distinctions, towards definable, valuable, and expressed common goods and commonalities for the human user. And this once again says, well, all right, now where do humans come into that loop? And how do they do that? And are we then prepared as humans to abandon some of our nationalistic orientations that to date have provided us with certain hegemonies, et cetera, and sort of trust that to an object of our own artifice and say, all right, you've got the con because we're going to screw up the pooch, and we'll keep a finger on this because what comes out the other side should be beneficial for us. But are we willing at that point to be, quote, the obedient child, if in fact we are understanding and trusting that these systems have parentalistic benevolence as a goal, but it may not be apparent to us each and every step forward.
Do you think, I mean, when you say that, it makes me think of sort of the way, where we're at right now, culturally, at least speaking, here in the United States, that people seem very willing already to surrender themselves to the whims of things that they've heard, be it from an authoritative source, that essentially the technology would take over, and all that's doing is just feeding into that what they're already willing to relinquish because they saw it on the news or they heard their favorite person say it about it, or they draw a distinction between what they're hearing in media, and they accept it as a reality. And it just seems like what you're describing is all that's doing is just getting outsourced to technology in a sense, and tapping into what they're already willing to do and believe and understand, because they, as Nixon said, they'll believe it because they saw it on TV.
Yeah, I mean, everyone was amazed at that movie Forrest Gump because there's Tom Hanks interacting with the late John Kennedy, right? It's like, wow, how'd they do that? I mean, these types of prestidigitations and legerdemain, they were common in film. We see it often. I mean, it's the kind of things that we allude to very often as the magic of the stage, right? Really, when we're talking about magic, all magic is an illusion. I mean, it's not like real magic where I turn literally a butterfly into the tiger. It's illusionism. So the question here is, are we falling victim to a new type of magic, which is the relative illusion of veridicality based upon, once again, the information that we're receiving and the way we heretofore have cognitively processed information as being veridical? Back to the Nixon quote, if I see it, I believe it. Well, come on, Tom Hanks was not interacting with JFK. I mean, but yet there it is. And there's a lot that we can do utilizing our technology that appeals not only to the sensory domain, but the perceptual domain. So we're taking these things in as sense data, and we're perceptually making some sense, some rationalization sense in the cognitive domain based upon its relative resonance to those things we know. The world works this way. Well, I think one of the problems with that is that in general, the public, the informed public, has not remained in step with what the science and technology are capable of doing. So we're essentially continuing to use yesterday's heuristics for the way we engage, acquire, and utilize information in the cognitive domain, despite the fact that the mechanisms and process for generating that information may be quite different and then require at least an additional, if not multi-additional, processing, integrative, and analytic steps. Again, we go back to some of the work of Merlin Donald saying as we move into this sort of cognitive technical domain, it becomes important for the cognitive domains to appreciate the technological capacities so as to be able to work cooperatively with them and not work subjunctively with them. So I think that level of subjugation of the human cognitive to what the science and technology is capable of doing in many ways rests upon our own responsibility to be obligated to understand the consequences of the things we build and the way we use them, which really gets back to the term technology. I think when many people use technology, what they're really referring to is techne, the tools themselves. I mean, I've advocated and will unapologetically reiterate here that I think we have to revisit and reground the word technology to what it means. Techne, logos, sort of a very rational accounting, a sort of a logocentric accounting of the tools that we build, why we build them, who's building them, what they're building for, and how they can be used in a variety of real world constructs and situations. So the logos to the techne is becoming ever more important as the techne is becoming capable of its own logos.
Hey, Doc, I want to bring us back into attacking and hacking the OODA loop. And I think one way to get there is we talk about automation bias, and I remember a little bit about automation. I did go on a dinosaur tour. I did not see any dinosaurs, so I was a little upset then. I asked for a refund. I didn't get one. But when you think about reducing human capability, automation bias can actually do that. It can actually attack our previous experience. It could be considered a way of attacking our cognition. There are a couple other elements in there that we can look at too, genetics and culture. So under those lenses, can you help us understand what are some of the technologies or ways that OODA hacking or neurohacking or biohacking, however you want to look at it, what are some of those ways that you're looking at now to improve human performance? And then take a look at the other side. It's what technologies are out there that are influencing our opponents or can be used to influence opponents?
Wow, that's a huge question. So, I mean, we can go from the relatively simple low-tech side to the rather complex and sophisticated high-tech side. So let's do that. I mean, the more we tend to learn about the brain and its interaction with the body and that brain-body interaction with whatever ecology or environment it's in, the more we're able to assess those particular nodes, networks, mechanisms, and processes. And by assessing them, we not only get a more, I think, detailed, if not precise, at least to date precise, understanding of how these things work, but we also develop a larger rostrum of targets. In other words, if we do the recon, so to speak, in the neurocognitive domains of the brain, that reconnaissance can provide us with what may be accessible and affectable targets for various types of manipulation. And then once you're talking about manipulation, I mean, you really have to think of any form of intervention as a rheostat. I mean, you can do things that are very, very mild and things that may be donnable or doffable, wearables, affectables, and you can do those things that are far more extreme, that induce a somewhat more durable effect on both brain substance and its structural functional relationships, inclusive of the cognitive, emotional, behavioral domain, and things that are exceedingly indwelling and therefore highly invasive. Although the current move in the field is to make that level of invasiveness minimized so as to be able to introduce things into the brain space in ways that are minimally invasive and non-surgical, but nonetheless as potent. A case in point, I think one of the more exciting projects that I've had the opportunity to interface with is a current DARPA project called N-cubed or N3, which is next generation non-invasive neuromodulation. And again, this is not a high side project. Our listeners can go to www.darpa.mil and just look up N-cubed or N3. And it's a very interesting and I think in many ways highly provocative project, because what it allows us to do is to utilize state-of-the-art engineering to be able to introduce vast arrays of sensors and transmitters into the living brain that make that brain and its functions accessible in real time remotely. So, I mean, here, clearly you've gone from things that are relatively low tech. If we assess the brain, we can understand various things that we can do environmentally, human terrain team, interpersonal interactions, various forms of optimal healing ecologies, environments, nuances, training milieu that can then create particular capabilizations in performance, in key domains of performance, being sensitive to all the parameters of performance that we have to appreciate. In other words, certain aspects of performance might work within a system, within a neurological system, but then the system by its nature is set up, its biology is to counterbalance sort of increases or decreases within its system so things even out. So how many systems do we need to affect to be able to get a deliverable change in some measurable performance metric, whatever that may be, cognitively, behaviorally, decisionally, emotionally, whatever. The other issue is that at what point do those outputs of optimization asymptote? In other words, it just can't get any better. I mean, the case in point that my longstanding colleague John Shook and I like to talk about is, well, think about something like beauty. I mean, once somebody's like drop dead beautiful, how much more beautiful are they going to get? And is it really noticeable that, wow, you've really gotten ever more beautiful? Once somebody is the global, chess champion, judo champion, wrestling champion, how much better are they going to get when they've beaten everyone and continue to beat everyone?
Right.
Well, things change, however, if in fact those methods that individual uses to become as beautiful as they possibly can be, or as potent on the wrestling, judo, archery, whatever field as they are suddenly then popularized.
Yep.
So now you're not the only one. Now you're beginning to get a little bit of that brinksmanship. And then what ends up happening is the threshold shifts in terms of what represents not only good enough, but perhaps the ideal. So what this then causes is a relative escalation in that need to then develop new tools and technologies to be able to not only run with the pack, but in some way to be ahead of the pack. But here too, there's an asymptote. You can only get so much. I mean, realistically, if we take a look at even the most avant-gardistic interventions, they're enhancements. And if you keep going, you then get radical modifications. You're now being able to do things that humans as a species simply don't do or can't do. Seeing in the infrared or ultraviolet range, being able to hear ultrasonically or subsonically, and a variety of other performance metrics and capabilities. Humans as a species have not been able to do this. And it's not just a question of donning some piece of equipment like an airplane or an aqua lung to do it. It's actually modifying the inherent structure so as to be able to then create these physiological capacities, characteristically by linking them either as hybrid or chimeric with some machine system. That's true, that's true cybernetics. That's a true cybernetic organism, cyborg.
But this is possible. Sensory substitution is possible?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I mean, look, let's face it. I mean, there are plenty of military programs who have sort of taglines like dog's nose, cat's eye, bat ear. And these are all oriented towards creating an increased sensorium in the human user so as to be able to capabilize a broader range of functions towards health, operational protection, enhancement, and survivability.
Are you saying the NVGs we wore years ago, cat's eyes, are sensory?
Say again?
The cat's eyes we wore years ago? They're
the NVGs, right.
Okay, I never thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the idea there was we're trying to be able to develop some type of sort of fancy word, felino-mimetic, in other words, cat-like night vision.
Yeah.
And in many ways, there are a whole bunch of other things that have grown from that. I mean, there are things that we can do within the ultrasonic and subsonic auditory range, the idea of being able to develop some type of modified sniffing device that allows you to literally have at least an increased acuity across a range of odors that can then be translated into some odor that exists within the human neurosensorium and say, oh, it smells like, so an IED smells like bad fish, all right? So again, those projects have been underway. And of course, we can also take a look at things like exoskeletal suits, the idea of being able to link motor control and sensory control to controlling some type of automated system, such as a drone, whether it's an aerial drone or submersible or land-based drone. And then again, the idea of utilizing machine systems, computational systems, to be able to decipher, if you will, or recognize certain patterns of human neurological, electrophysiological activity before the human user does, so as to be able to then cultivate those types of activities in that they are directional towards performance metrics. So the machine is priming and guiding the neurocognitive function of the human user in ways that are obtuse or opaque to the human user, but the machine is able to pull that out. So utilizing things like neurofeedback, utilizing stimulatory-based EEG mechanisms, whether it's transcranial electrical and magnetic stimulation, various types of vagal nerve stim that use real-time sensors. So the multidirectionality and reciprocity is there. So to take that back one step, even with radical modifications, there tend to be certain ceilings on radical modifications, not least of which is how radically modified the user wants to be, right? And what might be the longer term implications. In other words, yeah, this is great for now, but a year from now, you're going to have a horn with purple flowers growing out of your head. You okay with that? Some people may be. I mean, you and I have both worked with the SOCOM community. They're like, give it to me. It's going to make me a better war fighter and operator. Yeah, give it to me. Give it to me now. I'm already in harm's way. So yeah, I can deal with a horn sticking out of my head. But not universally. I mean, underwritten to that concept is that, well, somebody's going to take care of me, right? I mean, you guys are going to keep doing research. And this is one of the things that we've argued for, is it's okay to go there, but there better be at least some clear information to whoever's going to be the consented user that we're either going to continue the research or take care of you or not. And if the answer is we're not, well, then if you want to be the new neurocognitive neuronaut, go right ahead. You're boldly going where nobody's gone before, but cowboy, you're on your own. We're not going to take care of you. Not to mention the fact that if we put some gizmo in your head, that's a fancy neurological term, we put some glow winky or gizmo in your head and you get version 1.0, and 5 years from now, version 2.0 comes out. No guarantee you're going to get version 2.0. That could render you and your system obsolete. You want fair? Go to Iowa in the summer. There's a great fair every year, but we just can't build that into this equation. Or are we? Are we? And the other aspect of that is, yeah, there's only so much we can do to our own. And then at some point, you have to think to yourself, is it far more cost effective in terms of time and literal cost in terms of 6.0 to 6.3 plus project development to just do stuff to your competitors. In other words, you can either optimize your own, or you can denigrate them. And those two things are not necessarily on two separate sheets of paper. I mean, the same methods we can utilize to optimize our own, if flipped on its head, so to speak, can be used to denigrate, disrupt, or even in some cases, functionally and parametrically destroy your competitors or those with whom you're in conflict.
Hey, Doc, we're coming up on about an hour time right now. What I'd like to do is invite you to stick back or stay back with us, and we'll go into overtime, and we'll dive more into the attacking mode, influencing somebody's OODA loop, as well as maybe diving into some neuro data, some ethics and things like that. I know we have a lot more to dive into, but I do want to thank you for being with us today. And for our listeners, please join us over on our YouTube channel where you can pick up the video of all this and continue with their conversation there. Mark, do you have anything for the doc before we go into overtime?
No, I have a long list of things to talk about in overtime, and I just want to reiterate what Ponch said. Thanks, and Semper Fidelis.
Yep. Semper Fi.
All right, Doc. I appreciate that. This is awesome. Let's continue this on the attack. So I do want to look at neuro data a little bit later on, who owns it and all that. I know that's a big topic, and then the ethics behind this. The optimization is fascinating. Sensory substitution, seeing this with hearing capabilities for those that are hearing impaired. We're learning more about autism. We're learning how to use devices to get that feedback and maybe even some capabilities on the body to see when people in our family are not paying attention to what they need to be paying attention to. So this is just fascinating. What else do you have in store for us on the hacking side?
On the optimization side?
Optimization, yes.
Yeah, it goes all the way from genotype to phenotype to sociotype. Right? So, if you want to be very, very interventional, one could take a look at CRISPR modifications. CRISPR just adds to the genetic toolkit. We actually had a pretty good genetic toolkit. The only thing that CRISPR does is kind of brings it across the finish line and makes it a lot more facile and affordable. Facile in terms of its relative ease of actually doing the stuff, and affordable in terms of the cost, both the time it takes as well as the actual price it takes to do these kind of things.
Yeah.
And, we were kind of stepping and fetching for a while thinking, oh yeah, well, this is great in animal models, whatever, we're not going to do it in humans. Well, our Trans-Pacific peer competitor said, yeah, we can do it in humans. And what that did is that it advanced, if you will, the playbook one step. And once you move those pieces on that proverbial global chessboard of what can be done, you then entertain the discourses about what should be done. And in the interim, what you're really doing is you're scratching your head and scratching your butt going, well, can we do the things we should? And very often the answer is no, so let's just do this anyway. Let's face it, something like CRISPR or other forms of genetic modification, not only in utero, but postnatally and throughout the lifespan, have tremendous biomedical potential. We're seeing this in things such as being able to treat intractable neurogenetic disorders such as Huntington's, certain predispositions for genetically induced motor neuron disorders like ALS, the idea of some of the dystrophies, some of the neurometabolic syndromes and so forth. But let's not kid ourselves. If what we're able to do is identify even cursorily those genetic pathways that either through convergence, multiple genes coming together to produce a phenotype, or divergence, a few genes working to create broad phenotypes, if we can understand those patterns and relationships, those are targetable entities for whatever happens to be those phenotypic or endophenotypic expressions, inclusive of capabilities for cognition, emotion, and behavior. So is there some direct ability through the genome to be able to then produce structures that we know are influential and contributory to certain functions? Yeah, you bet there is. Absolutely. Are we there? We're certainly in the anteroom. I think we've certainly crossed that threshold, demonstrating the viable capability and survivability of CRISPR and related genetic techniques in humans. The question then becomes, well, what's going to happen with the longer term effects? So in other words, are we now getting what are sometimes referred to as Vexelblad effects? Basically being we dicked around with nature because we thought we knew how it worked until we dicked around with it. And then, oops, surprise, we didn't know how it worked. And down the line, next thing you know, people are growing tails and whatever. Yeah. Well, okay. Again, this argues back to the need for, if what you're going to do is to engage that construct, then you also need to have the contingency of continuity of both research and clinical care. Or at very, very least, inform people that you either have it or you don't. If they want to go, they want to do it, great. So genetics represent one area. The other area of genetics that I think is fascinating is epigenetic modification.
Right.
So the idea that you need not necessarily interact directly with the extant genome, but by identifying particular epigenetic dispositions and viable trends in that individual, be able to alter epigenetic expression through relatively low or relatively high-tech means. And in altering that epigenetic expression, what you're essentially doing is inducing phenotypic shift. So you're either doing it directly through the extant genome itself, or you're working through epigenetic modifications that are essentially switching certain genes and gene products on or off differentially through the lifespan, but doing so selectively. So we can work within the genetic area. If we bypass the genetic area or use the genetic area synergistically, we can then go into sort of the physiochemical biological area. And I view that as a single kind of entity, right? By affecting the physics, literally the physical chemistry of particular molecules on a variety of scales, now from the nano all the way up to the sort of gross network, node network effect. Okay. You're able to affect the chemistry. By affecting the chemistry, you're able to affect the biology, not only in terms of the chemical biology, but that chemistry also plays into structure. And very often what we tended to think, and again, I mean, as a neuropathologist and as a neuroscientist, we put the chemistry in one little silo, and we put the anatomy in the other silo, forgetting that the anatomy is built upon the chemistry. So if we change the chemistry, we can change the building blocks of that anatomy in a directable way. And if we change the physics, we can change the chemistry to change the anatomy and vice versa. And we're now understanding that the way a brain works is far more like a Wi-Fi network than like a conventional wired telephone network. The wires are there, the interconnectivities are there, but that's not really how the thing works. It works by forming cliques of cells that are differentially activated into discrete node network patterns based upon the anatomical configuration and characteristics of the structures of various areas of the brain. The brain works far more like a Hilbert space, an n-dimensional Hilbert space that affords much, much broader range of communicative capacity than we thought before. And part of that is our new understanding of physics and the fact that although pure quantum effects are probably not sustainable in mechanical systems, if you're coming from a quantum-based substrate, you're retaining certain quantum characteristics, even in a mechanical system, that predispose that mechanical system to what may be what looks like freaky effects that are quasi-mechanical. In other words, communication at a distance based upon resonant features that literally resonate with various structures based upon very, very subtle change in local and or macro environments. And we now know that's how the brain works, which increases its communicative sophistication, speed, and efficiency many, 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 many times over. Okay. So we have that capability. Okay. And that is an effectable capability, essentially using three domains, again, using the physical domain energetically, using the chemical domain, and then utilizing the biophysical domain on a variety of scales, from the cellular all the way to the socio-environmental, right? I mean, things feed back environmental, socio-psychobiologically, just as they go chemo-bio-psychosocially.
Yeah.
And then the last domain, which I think is equally important to entertain in this capacity, is the actual ability to develop those devices that are specifically interactive. And those devices, again, range from things that are applicable to the brain and body system. I mean, here, donables and doffables, wearables, you have to put the individual in the device.
Right.
To those things that are far more remotely and or distantly capabilized, directable forms of energy. Things that are not necessarily wearable, but things that are intrinsic, implantable on a variety of levels, whether they're implantable, again, actually within the brain, or whether there's some mechanism within the brain, inclusive of a chemical mechanism, that can then be engaged peripherally by changing the overall physiologic tone or by making that particular brain far more susceptible to externalized forces. So there's a lot of things we have in our potential toolkit right now, and they're at various stages of development and iteration along the research, development, test, evaluation, and use pathway.
Doc, this is incredible. I do want to come back to CRISPR and epigenetics in a moment as a way to attack. Right now, I do want to take a look at psychedelics with you and maybe some other modalities. We know a lot of veterans are going through PTSD, TBI, other like anxiety, stress, and they're using psychedelic assisted therapies to overcome that. That's an outside in approach that it has some bearing on neuroplasticity, right? The way the brain's wired. What can you tell us what your thoughts are on psychedelics, or maybe other, what do you call them? There's other type of psycho drugs out there. Benzodiazepines being another one.
Well, my cousin took me to Woodstock when I was 10, so I could talk all about psychedelics.
When you were 10?
When you were 10? Wow.
Well, that explains everything then.
Yeah, it sure does. She convinced my parents. It was like, we're going to a concert. And they were like, yeah, cool, concerts are cool. We only got as far as the throughway, but it was okay. I left the tape.
Now we know where you were born in 1959. So.
Yeah, exactly right. See, there was a reason for everything. Yeah, I left at 10. I came home from the concert. I was 25.
Nice.
It was an eye-opening experience. But let's use that as an example. Okay. The psychedelics were developed for a variety of purposes, not least of which is the whole idea of psychedelicis, mind expansion. And in some cases, the psychedelics were seen as viable clinical tools. I mean, certainly the whole Timothy Leary movement of the early and middle 60s was indicative of that. And the social spread of the psychedelics was because they work. I mean, if they didn't work, they wouldn't become popular. And so literally getting them out of the bag, taking that cat out of the proverbial bag, well, it's great. Well, now we got this cat on our lap. That's cute. We can pet the cat. It purrs. It's really cute. Yeah, but it's got teeth, claws. It's got a pooper. All right. And so with so many things, I think there are a number of interactive factors that needed to be taken into consideration. Number one, did we really know how they worked? And the answer was no. We had a basic idea of what was going on in terms of the neurochemistry and pharmacology. But the more you know about the substrate, the more you know about the brain on a variety of levels, the more you know about the molecular and physical chemistry, the more you know how these things work in a much more detailed way that provides insight that could fuel better judgment on how they could or should or shouldn't be used. Number two is once these things get out into the public, all bets are off because now you don't have any effective clinical gatekeeping in terms of dose, timing, individual differences, pharmacogenetic variabilities and vulnerabilities. Good luck. I mean, good luck. And then the third is once these things then became regulated and then became controlled substances, there was then the imposition of this level of legal liability and litigiousness that forced much of this underground and made these things, quote, bad, which in many ways stultified, if not completely ended, a lot of the research that was ongoing, other than those things that were focal to addiction. And again, many of the psychedelics, although they may have been thought early on to have addictive potential, that was more psychological commonality and psychological, if not dependence, but reliance rather than a true pharmacological addiction. The other issue was with the actual preparation. I mean, as these things moved out of the clinic and into the community, the preparation of these drugs became somewhat more bastardized, and therefore the relative purity, the sort of the specificity and precision of their pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics may have shifted. So then you get into dosing issues, purity issues. Basically, this is a shitstorm. So fast forward. So a lot of the research that I was doing during the middle 1980s and much of the stuff that actually got me involved with the military was Navy-funded work looking at a drug called methylene dioxymethamphetamine. Street name is ecstasy, Molly. And the original thought was that this would be an ideal weaponizable agent because it makes people feel really good. And it was thought at that time that it rots your brain cells. It causes a particular degenerative effect in a particular subclass of brain cells that utilize the neurotransmitter serotonin, and it causes them to wither and sort of like retract and become all sort of, withery and wretchy on the vine. That's not true at all. I mean, what we found out actually occurs is that you cause this dumping effect of serotonin, and the physical chemistry of that actually causes those nerve endings to retract because they're not full of those vesicles that provide the necessary physical appositional structure to keep those end branches puffy. So basically, it's like deflating a balloon. The balloon deflates, then you reinflate the balloon reinflates. There's no loss of attachment, so to speak. It wasn't that you're knocking out brain circuits. But I bring that up to you for an exemplary reason. Interest in the sort of chem bio domain has always been there. It's just a question of how much we know and what do we do with what we know and what do we do about the stuff we don't. And so given that science by its nature is self-critical and self-revising, what do we do with these revisions? Well, one thing to do with the revisions is revisit the meaning of what this revised information essentially confers and should contribute. And I think that's where we are with many of the psychedelics, which has really brought us to a multifold capabilization. Number one, do they produce psychedelia? Yeah, they do. Number two, is psychedelia a simple binary, or does it exist along a relative spectrum of capability and effect that may be dose dependent? Seems to be, which then gets us into the whole microdosing issue. And then the other is actually, what is the mechanism of that psychedelia? And is psychedelia a necessary component for some of the other potential effects that these may have in terms of both dose-related effect and how they then interact with a neural system that has some level of pathogenesis, that has some pathology. So the neural system that may be disrupted because of some type of traumatic stress occurrence or condition, the individual who has treatment refractory depression, anxiety disorders, et cetera, might in fact have a very, very different set of initial conditions that are important to understand the underlying mechanism of these drugs, because this could then have a directable effect in a very positively valent way. So what we've done is we've reopened the book with far more information necessary to write those chapters, with the hope that we're going to revise the previous chapters that were based upon information available at the time. No great sin there. That's just sort of, if you will, harmless naturalism. But we can't rely on those old data when we have new information, new data that are far more precise, far more specific, and therefore much more relevant.
Fantastic. Thoughts on alcohol? Alcohol's on base. It's a drug, right?
Yeah. You're talking to a guy with an Italian last name. So, I mean, growing up in a...
I read an article once that sailors and Marines use alcohol occasionally.
Yeah.
I think that's fake news. I'm not buying it.
I don't buy it either. Come on.
I don't buy it at all. I think there's no occasionally about it. So I can tell you that from experience. I mean, a lot of that is cultural too. I mean, I wasn't joking when I said, coming from an Italian Tyrolean background, we were kind of breastfed on that. We thought one was red and one was white, and that's what we were breastfed on. It was on every tape. So there was no inherent taboo. I think that we're learning a little bit more about some of the adverse effects, the multisystemic adverse effects alcohol can have. But I think we're also understanding that there are some potentially beneficial aspects of moderate to mild alcohol consumption. The question is, how do we then literally filter out those deleterious characteristics and effects and preserve those that are somewhat more beneficial? Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, clearly, for a number of individuals, they're using alcohol for its inebriant effects, right? I mean, you want to cop a buzz. It makes you feel good. Yeah, fine. Is there a way to sort of make you feel good without some of the deleterious effects that we're seeing, the hepatic effects, the other multi-system effects? Debate on whether or not alcohol is predispositional to certain types of cancers. And again, I think a lot of it goes back to the older Aristotelian mean. I mean, doing things in moderation, but then defining what moderation is. And this is where I think issues such as precision and personalized medicine really need to step to the plate. Yeah. What may be moderation for me might not necessarily be modification for you or Joe Schmuckatelli or Sally Slip and Slide. So how do we then use the tools and methods we have at our disposal to be able to determine what are those optimal limits, parameters, and thresholds for individuals throughout their lifespan, so as to maximize those positive effects, if you will, benefits, and minimize burdens, and also do so in ways that are going to be maximally efficient in those who may have minimal opportunity for that information. So these are the kind of things that we're wrestling with, which, again, recognizes the reality of, I'm not going to say the ubiquity of alcohol, but certainly its relative presence, and I think its socially acceptable presence, but also needs to take into accord that, I mean, the social environment is a human enterprise, and we're humans who are doing that enterprise, and we're therefore responsible for the consequences of our own effects and actions. So looking at those ways that alcohol confers relative benefits, as well as the burdens, risks, and harms, then becomes important for our revisionist stance for not only what we put into it and how we use it, but what are the actual parameters for use And again, I think the more we're learning about our biology, the more specific and precise we need to be. It's great to give lip service to personalized and precision medicine, but it's something quite different when we're actually looking at it in a health promotions model. This is much of the work I'm doing with my colleague in Germany, Professor Nico Kohls. What is contemporary health promotions on the global stage based upon key individuals and what it is they're doing within particular collectives and communities? And then how do we take that into a larger modeling that is then both viable and valuable in real world contexts?
Doc, a little bit more on this, on diet, food, and genetics. We understand that what we eat matters, right? And really about brain performance too. Today, we have a lot of performance drinks out there that probably are not good for your brain. Caffeine seems to be okay for a moment. But how important are genetics in determining what people should be eating?
Let's go back to your example of caffeine.
Okay.
So one of the things that we recognize is that humans are what we call heterogeneous for the particular expression of a gene that is important for the relative metabolism of caffeine. It's called the CYP gene. And some people are rapid metabolizers and some people are very slow metabolizers. And what we know is that there are differential effects downrange, beneficial as well as burdensome, if not potentially risky effects of caffeine, that are not based upon the caffeine, but are based upon the individual's metabolic profile, which is, at least in part, genetically determined, and perhaps may even be genetically modifiable. So the issue there is not just to take a look at genetics, genomics, and or even epigenetics, but to say, all right, now what does that mean with regard to interactions with various things that we have in our environments? And then what can we do on a variety of low to high tech ranges to be able to modify those responses so as to optimize the outputs?
Processing here.
As I've just finished some caffeine.
Yeah, I mean, so the same is true, for example, with regard to alcohol. So there are some people who are rapid metabolizers and there are some individuals who are not. And each and all of us has some capacity to modify that. This is going to go over great with your listeners based upon the amount of booze we drink. Those are inducible enzymes. The more you drink, the more you can. I mean, they're saturable. It gets to a particular point. But there are some people who have a very, very high tolerance, so to speak, for alcohol. And we know that even those individuals with a high tolerance, if they become abstinent, after a drink or two, suddenly they find their tolerance has decreased quite a bit. No magic there, nothing supernatural.
You call that the shampoo effect.
Correct. It's called the immersion effect. So the whole idea of the bourbon bath, for example, on a regular basis, I mean, clearly that's going to get your enzymes up.
Yeah.
So the more those enzymes are workable, the more we can metabolize. Well, that's a good thing or bad thing. I mean, it's just a thing. But we're seeing this across a variety of other systems as well. And it may be the same for the psychedelics, for example. We know that there may, in fact, be very, very different genetic and or phenotypic expressive patterns of certain receptors, serotonin receptors, and not just the receptor, but the actual membrane environment in which that receptor lives, that may be differentially reactive to certain psychedelics. So it may be that for some individuals, they have a higher capacity to bind those psychedelics. And in some cases, not only to bind those psychedelics, but to hang on to that psychedelic at the binding site, which gives it a very, very different response set of parameters. So for some individuals, they do very, very well on very, very, very low doses. Whereas for other individuals, higher doses are necessary. And we know this in other domains of medicine. The question then becomes, are we at a point where we're taking that knowledge and that capability and putting it into viable and broad-based enough use for it to have health promotional benefit? And the short answer to that question is generally no. So more needs to be done there.
Okay. So we're not proponents of recreational use of psychedelics or anything like that. Our view is really it needs to be controlled. In fact, we know a lot of folks that are inside the DoD now that are on the MDMA studies and leading that as well. So it's interesting that you had that connection years ago to bring that up during this episode. I want to switch over to epigenetics and as an attacking mechanism, and mainly from the perspective of overuse of technology for kids, things like TikTok or access to iPads or the dangers of being in front of technology all the time. Can you talk a little bit about that as a potential way to attack our OODA loop?
Yeah, well, I mean, that opens a Pandora's jar. I mean, it really does. So you take a look at some of the work of somebody like, for example, Manfred Spitzer, who's discussed the idea of digital dementia. Some of Spitzer's argument is that the more we use these various digitalized computational techniques and technologies, the quote, dumber we're becoming. I disagree. I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, I think we can look throughout much of human history, and what we see is that there is an iterative use of a variety of different methods and tools that humans have put into play so as to be able to simplify the way they're able to acquire and utilize information in those ways that are important to survival and flourishing. That's been sort of part of the human condition. Again, I refer back to some of the very important work of Merlin Donald, who's traced these epochs of the way human cognitive function has occurred in conjunction with the use of our set of various toolkits. As the tools tend to improve and become more capable and more sophisticated, what you're seeing is that not only are the cognitive processes necessary to generate those tools becoming more capable and sophisticated, but then as a consequence of the use of those tools, we're seeing in some cases a gradual shift in cognitive capacity, and in other cases far more of a Kuhnian paradigmatic shift in our cognitive capacity. I think the ubiquity of information that has been afforded by computational and cyber systems has represented not only something of an evolutionary change in cognitive capacity, but a revolutionary change. In other words, we can't go back to where we were before. That's not to say that those are things that we can't do. I can still go to the library, take a book out and physically read it. And there's a lot of things for me personally that I think are very tangibly appealing about opening a book and reading it, whether it's on an airplane or night before I go to sleep or whatever. So it's not a question of making certain things completely superfluous, but it's a question in many cases of synergizing those things. Can I still open up a research paper, a journal, a book and read? Yeah, I can. Can I also acquire information on the internet as to where to get that book, what book that information is in, and perhaps to order that book on real time? Sure, I can. I don't have to wait for the library to open any longer to do that or find the book. I can find the book. But I can go one more step. I can actually find the information, and through that information, I can then cross-reference that information to be able to engage, if you will, an almost fractal capabilization of my cognition in a much shorter period of time. So I'm able to do more in less time. I don't care how you twist that. That's an efficiency metric. So in many ways, our techniques and technologies are adding not only to the effectiveness of our cognitive capability, given the ubiquity of information that is literally at our fingertips, but also the efficiency of the acquisition and perhaps use of that. I can now transmit that information to you via electrons in seconds, where it used to have to be that I have to write you a letter and send it by post. So what we're seeing is certain compressions in terms of the temporal framework with particular expansions in terms of the volume frameworks, quantities, and breadth. And as a consequence, that has to be appreciated in terms of its relative progress and positive developmental aspects. There's never a free lunch. I mean, I disagree with Manfred Spitzer that we're getting some form of cognitive dementia, but I also think that one of the things that goes along with that, where I do agree, is that you are getting an increased level of reliance. In other words, you're getting digital dependence.
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, as you know as well as I mean, if there was something on the tip of your tongue 10 years ago, you have to think about it or call a friend and go, oh, come on, what was the name of that, who sang Let's Get It On? Come on, it's right on the tip of my tongue. Who is, no more.
Marvin Gaye.
Now all you gotta do is just hum the damn thing into your iPhone, and it'll tell you, Marvin Gaye, Let's Get It On, 1973, Motown. So we're using now different methods of information access, acquisition, and use, affordability, and provision. And this also requires a knowledge and skill set. So I think what we're seeing is not necessarily the loss of certain things in a pathologized way, but the gain of certain things. But with the gain of anything comes certain burdens, and those burdens need to be appreciated as well.
Do those burdens include stress and burnout from having that extended mind to my computer or to my iPad or to my iPhone?
Well, I mean, you and I know that when we were both wiggling sticks in an airplane, we talked about the idea of chasing snakes in the cockpit and helmet fire, right?
Yep.
Information overload and becoming overcome by events. And those events can be informational events. The whole beauty of the 14 platform is there was a guy in back, there was a Rio. And so, you were wiggling the stick and punching the pedals, and the guy in back was basically tracking where the bogeys and bandits were and giving you that level of situational awareness. One of the problems with some of the newer airframes is that they've increased, if you will, the amount of information that needs to be processed by the pilot, absent a Wizzo or a Rio or an ECMO. And as a consequence, becoming more dependent upon the machine system to filter what information needs to be presented to the pilot at that particular time. Well, if it's simply feed forward, well, then what you're really asking the human component to do is to adapt to the rapidity, speed, and or tenor of the device, the machine system. But if there's a feedback mechanism, well, then things become a little bit more cooperative. In other words, what can the pilot handle at this time? It may not necessarily be important for the pilot to monitor fuel state, hydraulic pressure. Yeah, we see that both engines are turning pretty good. I've got good suck pressure on both. I want to know my armament state is pretty good. But what's important for me right now is to track this thing that looks like a bogey, might be a bandit. Oh, and what else? So again, it's not just a provision of information, but it's that parsing of information so as to be able to add some precision to what would essentially be the pilot's BUDAC, bias, observation, orientation, decision, action, and consequence schemata. But again, that requires reciprocity of the machine system as it's created. So I think where we're at a point is that there's a lot of things these technological systems can do. There's a lot of things we can do with them. But there are also important steps that need to be taken so as to maximize or optimize our performance capability interactively with those machines so as to avoid those detrimental, burdensome, if not negatively harmful effects that machine overload and becoming overcome by the events of machine use and technology use could incur.
Okay. Just looking at my notes here. Back on the attacking side, there's a potential that the data that are collected can be used against us. So 23andMe, you get some other commercial technologies or access that people have to provide information to somewhere, some black box somewhere. But that information can be used against us. Is that true? And if so, what are your views on who owns that data?
Look, as anyone who's been divorced will tell you, any amount of information can be used against you. I mean, let's face it. I mean, it's even part of the readable Miranda rights. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. So any information that is available about you or from you is essentially bivalent in its capacity to provide information that is useful, but to what intent? I mean, everybody's got skeletons in their closet. I mean, it's just a question of what those bones mean and how people wield them. Harkening back to that wonderful scene in 2001, a bone is a weapon. You got skeletons in your closet. I can whack you over the head with those bones. So I think part of the issue is to what level are biodata maintained as secure? Now, you mentioned 23andMe, and there are certain safeguards in place that are not altogether fail-safe, something like GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, I think is important. But what you have to then consider in a broader context is something we began speaking about over an hour ago, which is, well, under what set of laws and governances? Yeah, GINA may be applicable here in the United States, but what if the provenance of the custodianship of that data is extranational? Do U.S. laws comport? Are they sustainable? Or are they not? And what is the basis of ownership in terms of intellectual property that would then allow, even under international law, the proprietary use of that information by whoever is going to be, again, the custodial or provenential ownership? And so as a consequence, there are a whole bunch of socioeconomic and commercial factors that need to be figured into this quasi-calculus to be able to determine the relative probity and safety of these data, not least of which is what kind of data are we talking about here? In my area, in sort of the neurocognitive sciences, there's really nothing that is mimetic for GINA. back in 2012, a very, very astute law student at that time, now an attorney, named Stephanie Kostyuk, wrote a paper titled After Gina, Nina, the Need for a Neurological Information Non-Discrimination Act. I've said this before, I'll say it again, unapologetically. I wish I'd written that paper. It was one of the best papers I've ever written. It was narrow in its focus, but intentionally and purposely with regard to occupational discrimination. In other words, discrimination in primarily the workplace, inclusive of things like the provision of insurance based upon what may be neurological information suggestive of a longstanding neurological predisposition or a pre-existing condition. Is this individual insurable? Are they workable? Does this individual have particular neurological traits and characteristics that might render them more prone to injury on the job? We don't want to pay workers' comp, et cetera, et cetera. This individual has a set of neurocognitive skills, capabilities, knowledge acquisition traits that would render them either favorably disposed or not disposed for this particular job. And we do that all the time. I mean, let's face it, you and I went through the NAMI whammy down there with Fritz Copy. And there was nothing that wasn't probed, stuck. Let's face it. I mean, if the length from your butt to your knee wasn't right, you weren't getting ejection seats and you had to apply for a waiver. So the whole idea of exclusion, not qualified, NQ, whether it's NPQ, not physically qualified, or NCQ, not cognitively qualified, is not anathema to many of the systems that we engage, inclusive of things like university and college admissions. So, I mean, I think that those barriers, so to speak, are there, whether they're barrier exams, an MCAT, an LSAT, the SATs, whatever, whether those are ASVABs, whether those are induction examinations of the physical and or cognitive type. I mean, you remember going through flight school. There's a whole bunch of stuff you had to do. And if you didn't do it, and if you weren't getting ups on every flight, well, you're going to be a black shoe pretty quick, right? Mm-hmm. And there too, I mean, it's not a question of saying, well, aviators represent the ideal apical community.
I just want to point out that black shoes are people too. Okay.
I understand.
For the non-naval personnel, we're referring to surface warfare.
I'm not going to go down. I have a friend who, and I shouldn't even say it. We'll say it offline. But yeah, I mean, let's face it. We all started out in black shoes, right? So the other issue is, I mean, as well as I, there are specialty areas within every area of military operations across Marine Corps, MOS, various Army, Air Force, Space Force billets, Coast Guard, National Guard, and within the Navy. I mean, there are certain, I'm not going to say rarefied elites, but even among what might be not those groups, for example, you take a look at SEALs, special operations types, subbies, aviation types. And I'm not minimizing surface warfare at all, but I mean, it takes a lot to get sea wings. And every billet has its particular areas of specialization and engagement that require a profound skill set, knowledge set. You got to stay current. And everybody's looking to promote. And let's face it, in everybody's jacket, you have to have those particular set of skills that you've acquired, and it checks in the block in your jacket, right? Sure. But what if we could identify those individuals who have certain predispositional traits, characteristics, and capabilities, and segue them into various communities where those assets, as well as some of those absences, play favorably to their relative verticality of promotion and success, not to mention their health, operational performance capability, and their enablement to do those jobs, what we refer to as the HOPE acronym: health, H, operational protection, OP, and enablement to do the job you're billeted in, E, hope. So we see great neurocognitive hope in being able to engage these assessment and even interventional methods in those ways. So I think that there's something there, and what that then means. But there's also the question of who gets the goodies, who doesn't, what are the metrics, methods, and machinations for deciding who gets the goodies and who doesn't, and what happens when some individuals get the goodies and some individuals don't, and what happens to those individuals who get the goodies and then can't do that job anymore. So there's a lot of things going on there. Point number one. Point number two, as regards these data, very often the provision of who gets the goodies in that decision is based upon the data. Well, what else are you going to do with those data? What are you going to use those data for? One of our big concerns is that those data can be used in ways that are both pecuniarily problematic as well as biosecurity problematic. Let me explain. If in fact I have and let's just look at my area of specialization, my sandbox, because I can speak with at least experience, if not expertise. If I take a look at your neurodata, there's a whole bunch of neurodata there. I mean, some of it is very functional in terms of neurological functions, but others tend to have a little bit more expansive capability. Your cognitions, your emotions, your behaviors. It has, if you will, sort of psychodata implications as well as social data implications. The way you act, the way you may feel, the broad listing and roster of your decisions and what that means in various situations. All of these things are accessible and retrievable, by the way, utilizing current methods of big data. And we can do these in ways that are both anonymizable as well as non-anonymizable, that are directly referential then to you. I mean, if I'm going to use this in ways that are going to be precise and personalized, I have to de-anonymize these data and make them referential to you in some way. And there are ways to do that, even with relative security, utilizing some of these big data engines. The one that comes to mind is a DARPA-based system called ATRA that was actually then taken over by Accreta by our folks at Georgetown at the Cyber Smart Center, which is now called Aves Terra. That system is called Aves Terra. And it's a very sophisticated big data system that is essentially a black box data. There's sort of no human contact that maintains that level of anonymization until de-anonymization is required or necessitated. But even there, the flippage of that proverbial switch, de-anonymize, personalized, identification aspects, who's flipping that switch? Point number one. The issue reliant upon that is, what data do I have of you and what can I do with those data? Well, one thing I could do with those data is to create particular narratives and or to establish particular dispositions, predispositions, and biases in favor or not in favor of you or the way you are regarded and treated in and across a range of dimensions and domains within whatever is going to be your daily milieu. Work, home, out on the street, law enforcement, military, job, whatever, okay? The other issue is I can manipulate those data. And if I manipulate those data to the extent of relative minutia, which is certainly capable, in other words, not just your data, but your longitudinal data. I mean, literally, from the time that they held you upside down and slapped you on the butt. But more than that, I can get into your familial database. There's now an evidentiary record of the reality of whatever that data depicts. So if I want to demonstrate that there is a florid risk of profound psychiatric illness in your family, I could do that. If I want to put into your particular record that there have been evidences of transgressions of reality that might be indicative of your slipping into periodic psychosis, I could do that. So what you're going to come back and say is, no, that didn't happen. That's not real. But wait a minute. Now we're dealing with the fact that I'm calling you psychotic. So that's axiomatic to you see the problem? And not only are you saying, no, it isn't, I have evidentiary data that demonstrates that that is so. It's fake data.
Yeah.
It's like deep faking, but deep faking on a very, very different level. And I can change those data on a variety of scales, literally from the subcellular all the way to the social, from the individual to the international, from the personal to the political. I can put on your record that you've done certain things.
Yeah.
And it's there. And you may not even know it. Could affect your security clearances, could affect the way you're treated by law, could affect the way you're able to move internationally, levels of surveillance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Our adversaries
can go one step further. One step further.
Yeah.
If I have enough data about the structure and function that makes you you, that's a target-rich environment. Now I can use those data to develop, if you will, personalized precision pathologies. Crowded room, I know exactly what's going to hit your phenotype identically and stereospecifically. No one else is going to get affected. Why? Because I have your recipe for your secret sauce that indicates to me your vulnerabilities within a very, very defined set of ranges and parameters that essentially renders those things not only unperceptible, but not effective to anyone else, but only you. I can do that.
It seems like in an age of social media and, Ponch mentioned 23andMe, it seems like a lot of this stuff is relatively volunteered without obstruction. I mean, that's the
because
the
we're
value,
kind of
right?
stupid. I mean, There was a great, I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners or you guys like South Park, but there was a great South Park a few years back where the kids didn't read the instructions on something that came from Apple. And next thing you know, they were forced into being the human centipede. Remember that?
Yes.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
let's face it. I mean, one of the biggest lies that everybody tells everybody else is, yeah, I read the small print. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. You may have, and even if you did read it, did you read it in terms of its implications and not just its explications? And the short answer to that question is usually no.
Yeah.
You didn't get it. And so I think, again, it goes back to a point that we made earlier, that if we're going to build and create these technologies and make them relatively proliferant, if not ubiquitous, we have an equivalent responsibility to bring the polis up to speed in what they need to know about these technologies and how to use them. Again, it goes back to the logos with the techne.
It's terrifying. I mean, it really is.
Well, it's terrifying. It's interesting when you say words like techne and you go to these Greek root words. You know, it seems like these things have always been in existence. They're just manifesting themselves in different ways.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is too, yeah. And this isn't a slam. I mean, it's not. I mean, America has manifested a wonderful culture across a very, very large geography for the majority of our cultural time, even into the 20th century. We've been unilingual. I mean, early on, we're, if you will, a nation of immigrants who retained at least some of their cultural identities, inclusive of a multilinguality. But, you know, over the years, that's been diffused a bit. And although now one might argue that we're becoming, once again, multilingual, if not essentially polyglot in some ways, I think that historically what you found is that there have been certain errors in translation. Mm-hmm. And the errors in translation are not necessarily intentional errors, but they're errors of colloquialism. So terms like technology have become very colloquialized, but taking the word for what it is, and essentially breaking it down, I think re-imbues the meaning as to what that probably was all about. And if that wasn't the original intention, I think it certainly should be the new intention, given what it is we're capable of doing and what we should do about the things we do.
Gee, this has been fascinating. My head is a bit of fire hose. I think I wasn't expecting a fire hose today. Like this has been pretty amazing. A couple other questions for you, or topics maybe. Let's see. Culture. If we want to attack culture of another organization or individual, what does that look like? What does that mean? Is there anything that we can dive into there?
Wow. I think that one good place to start that we've always advocated in our work is to appreciate culture in its literal sense. I mean, if you think of culture like in a petri dish, right? Say, well, I want to culture something, like grow fungus, bacteria, right? So what is culture? It's both a medium for expression, and it provides relative attractors and constraints for growth, right? And the way that growth is expressed outwardly, okay? So I think if we think of human culture in the same way, I think we're in a pretty good shape. So what is the medium there? And in looking at that, now you have to look at things that are multidimensional. You have to take a look at history, but not just history, historicity. In other words, the way that history is incorporated into psychological, social, philosophical narratives. So the stories that history has generated, in which case that historicity is not always accurate for the actual historical events, but are reflective of the interpretive dynamics and meanings that are extracted from that as a consequence of those events. Right? So history and historicity, I think, are critical. By the same token, history and historicity gives rise to an understanding of needs. Needs by virtue of what things are in surplus, what things are in relative deficit, what are the behaviors and what are the sets of emotions that drive reaction to surplus deficit, what things are then viewed as positive or negative, what things are viewed as threats, and where particular domains of individual and collective dread lie. So here too, we're looking at values desiderata, and values negativity. What things do we like? What things do we don't? What brings us pleasure? What brings us pain? What do we value? What do we want to hang on to? And very often those two things together, history and values, are important in determining key constructs of the operational function of a culture. In other words, their philosophy. And philosophy has four very important domains. What is the underlying metaphysics? I mean, some cultural philosophies are a little more spiritual than others, and may even be somewhat more supernatural. I mean, let's face it, much of Judeo-Christian and or the Abrahamic religious cultures, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, have a very strongly supernatural component to them, which is not necessarily intrinsic to other cultures. They're far more naturalistic in their orientation, even religiously. Buddhism, Shinto. And although there may be gods, so to speak, very often those gods are manifest by control of the natural world, which is that which is accessible to us. So much of that metaphysics of a culture's philosophy feeds into its epistemology. What do they know and how do they know it? That too is based upon their history. So historically, how have they used various tools, whether those tools are observation or they're literally tools of artifact and implementation, to be able to know what it is they know, acquire that knowledge? And then how are they going to use those values, those needs, that knowledge, and those tools within the anthropological reality of that society? In other words, that collective. So the third dimension of their philosophy is the anthropological domain. In other words, what is it that they do as people, individually and collectively, and how do they define what they are, who they are, and what they do? Now we begin to get into certain things such as geographic locales. What are the ecological capabilities, insufficiencies, inadequacies? What are the dynamic interactions between the human components of that ecology and its various environmental components in terms of modification of the environment or modification of the human culture, society, activities, person? And then, of course, there's the intra-anthropologic. And if you take a look at that, I mean, we realize that human interactions are based upon both cooperation as well as competition. And much of our cooperation is in a competitive spirit. It's just a question of defining who we're competing against. Definable in-groups can range from individual all the way to, large-scale social collectives. But in-groups can also be in-groups in terms of kind, like kind. And as you know, throughout our history, we were very quick to parameterize what is a human kind versus a non-human kind. Our current understanding of neuroscience and biology has changed that a little bit. Now it's a question more of type or extent versus kind. What kind of creatures, for example, maintain consciousness, a mind, and that may even extend to machines. But still, the idea of who is us, that's the basis of cooperation. Not us is at least the basis for competition and in some cases conflict. So what you see is the dynamic interaction between cooperation with competition, and cooperation, competition, and conflict. It becomes something of a three bodies approach. And that's a problem because realistically, they're always sort of bubbling forth to some level of primacy. Where does the cooperation stop and the competition begin? Even within a particular group, what are the levels of competition, and how does that competition in some way spawn cooperation or vice versa? And then when conflict occurs, well, then how is conflict going to be defined in terms of where the boundaries of cooperation lie? And now we're talking about clearly the identification of what those groups of humans define to be relative goods. And as soon as you start talking about defining the good versus the not good, the rights and the wrongs, now you're in the fourth domain of philosophy, which is ethics. And clearly ethics can differ intra and interculturally as well. And these then need to be appreciated, if not responded and prepared for, because those definitions of good establish those things that are worth defending, either in a reactive or a proactive way. And how you defend against them is also based upon your underlying ethics as to what you consider to be valuable and what particular actions you're willing to take to maintain those things you hold to be near and dear and valuable to your kin and kith. So culture clearly plays, I think, an important point in the 21st century global shift. Mm-hmm. And our group has argued that it is, I think, indefensible in the current international environment, given the rise of cultures that heretofore were somewhat subordinated cultures, that we do not develop a far more cosmopolitanly cultural lens, inclusive of cosmopolitanly capable ethics, philosophies, policies, and laws that are then usable from that broad palette into a far more specific set of subpalettes that involve given collectives. In other words, A working with B, B working with C, rather than A, B, C, all the way to Z working together. The more pieces you put in, the more complicated those dynamics of interaction by virtue of philosophy, ethics, policies, and governances need to be.
Seems to me that there's a real lack in the study or interest in those things that you just talked about. Whereas, when you look at, when you subtract, say, Ivy Leagues and small liberal arts colleges, and you look at universities, those things that you're talking about are very rarely studied. The philosophy, that kind of thing.
I don't know if they're rarely studied, but I think what has happened is, as a consequence of the progression of STEM and what is harked as the importance, if not necessity, of STEM, science, technology, ethics, and maths, I think there's been an implicit, if not expressed, divorce from the humanities and social sciences. I mean, we forget that the social sciences are sciences, and they play a role in that science. Anthropology, sociology, political science certainly play a role, but the tools of the social sciences with regard to being able to exercise certain social effects very often include things like literature and media, certainly are exercised through things like policy and law, and even in literature and media, which you then talk about as the arts. And clearly axiomatic across all of those is the need to then educate the next generation in those ways that are capabilize that generation to deal with is going to be those opportunities and challenges. So education represents the keel. You don't get STEM without education. And very often education can be seen as both a science, a cognitive science, as well as a social science, because there is the sociology and anthropology of education, as well as its underlying philosophical basis. What we've argued for in our writing over the past 15 years is a paradigm we refer to as in-steps, integrated science, technology, ethics, and policy studies. Why? Because by engaging ethics, it becomes important to then understand those multidimensionalities of philosophy of ethics, that ethics are a part. In other words, taking ethics as a standalone is sort of like taking the ice cream without the cone or without the bowl. Yeah, you can understand it, but what are you going to put it in? I mean, basically, how are you going to eat it? And if you eat it, it's going to be messy and it's not going to work. So you have to sort of situate that within the bowl or the cup, so to speak. And that cup, that bowl, that cone is going to be the anthropological domain and the epistemological domain that are very, very important. Perhaps not so much the metaphysical, but certainly the epistemological and the anthropological domain. What do we know and how do we know it? And then how are we putting it to use in the human enterprise that represents this, our culture, interactive with itself, interactive with others? But any ethical analysis must begin and proceed from fact, which gets back to that epistemological basis. What do we really know and what do we not? Which goes back to the conversation we had earlier in terms of the role of education, not only in what I would call cold education, in other words, just hard, cold education, getting people in school, so to speak, but also general education more broadly so as to keep the polis apace with the technology that is available for it so it can use the technology in ways that are appropriate to acquire information in right and good ways. And right and good is veridical. And there's a whole discourse about fake news, etc. Yeah. And it's possible, and we spoke earlier about deep fakes and what kind of things we can do to create cognitive disruption by changing an individual's sensorium or perception and the cognitions and emotions and behaviors that go along with it. But I think that the in-steps approach is important because what it does is it regrounds science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to a human endeavor, and therefore becomes important to understand the human developers and users of those things in the various contexts and constructs of use that will be employed. It's technology, it's techne logos, where the techne is science, technology, ethics, and maths, And the logos is the social, scientific, and humanitarian and humanities dimensions that are very important to keep that in focus as human enterprise for human enterprise. That's what's been lacking. That integrative approach that reinforces the social sciences, arts, and humanities in those ways as essential to be able to not only understand and intuit, but to put into viable and good use science, technology, engineering, and math.
It's fantastic. In steps. I wrote that down here. Hey, Doc, we're taking up plenty of your time today. Like I said, my head is blown. It's a fire hose of information. We can keep recording here if you like, we can stop recording.
No, go ahead.
Couple questions to you.
Sure.
Any major threats or concerns to you based off of your work? I mean, is there anything that we need to be paying attention to? Any weak signals that you can share? Anything like that we can advise people to be? We got Neuralink, we've got XAI popping up. We have all these new companies. Anything pop up to mind that says, hey, this is something we need to be concerned about?
Well, Neuralink troubles me not because of what Neuralink is, but because of the way Neuralink can be used.
Okay.
I mean, we see a program that I think in many ways is far more advanced and capable than Neuralink, which is the DARPA N3 program, but obviously that's a gate-kept program. That's a DARPA program. So the regulatory gatekeeping is a governmental gatekeeping. And yeah, I mean, for some people, I mean, it's going to start to generate all kinds of conspiratorial thought and sort of antithetic postures about, well, the government is an off limit to my freedom. No. I mean, the bottom line here is that it is a governmentally gate-kept program, inclusive of what comes out of that program as CRADAs, as cooperative research agreements into the commercial space and how those things are going to be used. Less so with Neuralink. I mean, look, Elon Musk is a very, very bright, talented guy, but at the end of the day, what he is more than anything else is an entrepreneur. And the common value for entrepreneurship is entrepreneurial or economic success. I have not been impressed with the level of ethical and cultural philosophical dedication to the development and potential uses and misuses of Neuralink that Elon Musk has dedicated within that commercial enterprise. I've not been. I'm not saying that Elon needs to call me on the phone and go, hey, Jim, we want you to be our ethicist. That's not what I'm saying.
We can make that happen.
Well, yeah, performatively, I mean, that'd be great. But the issue is, like anything else, if they pay you to provide advice, the question is whether or not they're going to take it. And so I think the advice that I would give to a Neuralink, whether it's Elon Musk's Neuralink or any other of those, what may be soon to be released, very, very capable, very sophisticated, and very powerful, either direct or indirect to consumer neuroscience and technological developments, is be cautious of how these things are going to be distributed for a couple of different reasons. If you're not comfortable with the way research is done somewhere else, and that research can then lead to developments that are highly usable, will you be comfortable with the widget, the deliverable, or the product, even though you may not be comfortable with the research, and what are you going to do about it? Or if in fact that product then becomes viable, or that service then becomes viable somewhere else, but is not viable and available here, wherever here may be, what are you going to do about that medical tourism market? And what are you going to do about quality control? And what are you going to do about biosecurity? If you're putting instrumentation in individuals' heads, are you completely certain as to what that instrumentation is, consists of, its components, and what it could do, and what systems are yoked to that instrumentation? So it's a level of quality control, quality assurance, where quality represents a much, much broader rubric, inclusive of biosecurity by design and implementation. That's my concern about Neuralink and related technologies and methods and tools that are disseminable on the global stage, that may be provisable on the global stage, but may have very, very different parameters for their research, development, and perhaps uses in practice, that as a consequence of existing parameters of ethics and law are in gray zones, if not outside the box, for things that might be acceptable, if not now, in the near future. And those things need to be addressed. Now, I get it. I mean, there's something called the Collingridge effect, the Collingridge dilemma. In other words, you won't know about things that go wrong until you do something and those things go wrong. Got it. Understand. This is not one of them. And part of the reason for that is that things have gone wrong in systems like this, where they have been offered to the best buyer. And here you're getting diffusion of intent and or diffusing of application and use. And as a consequence, you're then getting this sort of fractal diffuse effect, which strays from what may be the ethical probity of its intentional design. That's not new. We've seen that before. The question is, can we use analogical reasoning to be able to substantiate that we may be in a similar boat here and we need to be prepared for it? Now, arguably, I would say the answer is yes.
How much of it is cat out of the bag? I mean, the cat's out of the bag. It's not going back in.
A bit. I mean, I think some of it is in terms of the actual technology. The technology is out of the bag.
Mm-hmm.
The uptake, the use, the production, and the dissemination, provision of that technology is still somewhat constrained. So I think part of the cat's out of the bag, but the cat's not completely out of the bag. There's still like two hind legs and a tail in the bag. And that may be able to tighten the cinch of the bag enough to be able to at least control the kitty, so that if you can't control the cat, at least you can put on slip covers.
I forget if it was on our show with us, Punch, maybe help me out, but Dave Snowden of Genome said something along the lines of insisting that software engineers or people that were creating AI, that they would have ethics, like some kind of training for ethics before they would devise systems that would have tremendous ethical impact on a culture, on individuals.
I think that ethics gets a lot of lip service, but doesn't get a lot of engagement. And I mean, and the other thing is, and I've said this in my lectures, ethics has a big mouth but no teeth. I mean, yeah, you can scream and yell ethical stuff all day long, and yeah, you can deafen people, and that may be deafening, and that by itself may be uncomfortable enough. But realistically, ethics busts very often along those lines. It's sort of like gumming somebody to death. You got to hammer away at it. And the truth of it is that the ethics can shift as a consequence of the culture in which that ethics is being enacted. Case in point, CRISPR babies, right? The ethical issues were well known. Let's face it, absolutely nothing happens in the People's Republic without the government knowing about it, particularly if it involves a commercial and research enterprise. It was a beta test, if anything. Let's just see what the international community has to say about CRISPR babies. Oh, yeah, they didn't take to it real well. Wrist slap. Yeah, but how long did the wrist slap last? And the wrist slap wasn't an ethical wrist slap. There's a lot of ethical noise making and drum beating, but it had to be something quasi-legal, or at least it looked legal from the outside. Policies and laws have teeth, but you have to be careful because they can take a bite out of productivity, development, and positive effects just as much as they can take a bite out of those things that come up and bite you in the fanny. So again, well-informed ethics that are based upon science and reflect the science, ethics that guide the science, and both science and ethics information that are important to then developing and guiding policy and law, represents what we consider to be the viable or the essential triune. They're all within the same. You can't take one out and be able to manifest the same level of complete triangulation and effectiveness, because you lose something when you do.
Hey, Doc, we're going to wrap up here with you, but is there anything you're working on? What's next for you? Just like what's your life like? What are you on next? What's coming up? Any new books? Anything like that?
Yeah. I mean, there's not a day that I go to work, whether it's from home or actually in the office, that I'm not having a good time. So as long as it's still fun, I'm going to keep doing it. I've been doing it for 42 years, so that's kind of fun. I'm still at Georgetown, so I'm the Pellegrino Center Professor of Neurology and Biochemistry and Ethics. I'm also their senior scholar in the Pellegrino Center for Ethics. I run their neuroethics program. We have a sub-program in military medical ethics that we do in conjoint with the Defense Medical Ethics Center at Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences in Walter Reed. That's all DoD ethics across all medical communities within the Defense Health Administration, the DHA. And that's established by a Department of Defense instruction back in 2019. And that's great fun because I work with absolutely stellar and brilliant colleagues at the DMEC and within the DoD. Continuing to do my work with the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Branch, Joint Staff Pentagon. I've been doing that for the past decade plus. Again, some very, very exciting projects. Right now, we're working on various domains of disruption and deterrence. And my particular area of the sandbox is how chem, bio, rad, and nukes have been used for and can be used for deterrence, both with regard to proactively in terms of optimizing capability of one's own side forces, as well as disruptive and destructive capabilities and deterrence against others. So it's an ongoing project. And then, just continuing some of our international work. I have some esteemed colleagues that I work with at the University of Applied Sciences in Coburg, Germany, primarily in the domains of health promotion as relates to science and technology and health promotions internationally and globally. And I'm very, very proud to continue to be a senior Stockdale Fellow at the United States Naval Academy for Science, Technology, Ethics, and Security. So, yeah, that's what I'm doing. Got a couple of books coming out in late 23, early 24. One to be published by MIT Press with my longstanding colleague, John Shook, and one to be published by Springer with colleagues Shook and Dr. Roland Benedictor of the URAC Center in Bozen, Bolzano, both of them looking at neuroscience and technology in culture. And the book with John Shook really examines what we consider to be the development and viability of neuroethics 2.0. In other words, next generation ethics, to be very brave so as to address these bold advances in neuroscience and tech on the global stage.
Fantastic. Hey, I'm going to stop recording here. And then we'll get some more questions for you.
Sure.
Yeah.